Now, we're going to look at a story. So let's start in 2 Samuel 24. And it's kind of sad. We're at the end of David's life, and David is going to commit a great sin. Now, usually when you talk to Christians and say, how often did David sin, King David? Most Christians would say he sinned one time with Bathsheba. That's not true. David sinned more than one time, and in fact, many believe that this was the greatest sin that David committed. And it's right near the end of his life. So let's read this, chapter 24, verse 1. Again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, go and take a census of Israel and Judah. Now, what we think is the Israelites had begun to turn away from the Lord. We're not trusting in God. And so the Lord suggests to David to take a census, to count the men of the nation of Israel, right? In the United States, don't we take a census every 10 years where we count everyone? Okay. So, verse 2. So the king said to Joab, that's the general of the army, and the army commanders with him, go throughout the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and enroll the fighting men, so that I may know how many there are. But Joab replied to the king, may the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times over, and may the eyes of my lord the king see it. But why does my lord the king want to do such a thing? The king's word, however, overruled Joab and the army commanders. So they left the presence of the king to enroll the fighting men of Israel. So they go around and they count. Let's jump down to verse 8. After they had gone through the entire land, they came back to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. Joab reported the number of the fighting men to the king. In Israel, there were 800,000 able-bodied men who could handle a sword. And in Judah, 500,000. David was conscience-stricken after he had counted the fighting men. And he said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. Okay, now let's stop there. And now flip over, don't lose that, flip over to 1 Chronicles 21. Same story. Actually, there's a lot more details. If you want to read more about the details, you're going to do that on your own. But let's start 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1. Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census of Israel. Do you notice anything different suddenly between the first account and this account? In the first account, who's the one that kind of riled up David to take the count of the men? The Lord. In this account, who is it? It's Satan. And this goes back to the answer is both. The Lord used Satan, and Satan tempts David to count the men. This is again, I know this is a high level, people like, oh, and this is thrown off theologians. That's why they say, don't preach on this passage. Because the common person is going to go, wait a second, what's going on here? There's a contradiction. The Lord in one place, Satan in another place. What's going on here? Verse 2, so David said to Joab and the commanders of the troops, go and count the Israelites from Beersheba to Dan. Then report back to me so that I may know how many there are. But Joab replied, may the Lord multiply his troops 100 times over. My lord the king, are they not all my lord's subjects? Why does my lord want to do this? Why should he bring guilt on Israel? The king's word, however, overruled Joab. So Joab left and went throughout Israel and then came back to Jerusalem. Joab reported the number of the fighting men to David. So let's come down to verse 8. Then David said to God, I have sinned greatly by doing this. Now I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. All right, we're done in 1 Chronicles. Come back to, now we're going to say in 2 Samuel.